I never thought humiliation could wear pearls and sip champagne. That afternoon, I sat in the third row of my sister's wedding at a sprawling Charleston estate, wearing a borrowed navy dress I had ironed twice to hide the wear. My son, Noah, 9 years old and beaming in a suit that cost me 2 paychecks, swung his legs beside me. He thought today would bring us back into the family circle. Maybe deep down I wanted that too. You're listening to this story on Renvenge Zinnia, where truths once buried are finally told in the voice of those who lived them. And if you've ever walked into a room hoping for love, only to be met with silence, or worse, polite smiles that cut deeper than words, you're not alone. Some wounds don't bleed, but they bruise us quietly for years. This space is for us, for the ones who stayed kind even when the world wasn't. If this kind of truth speaks to you, consider subscribing. We have more stories that don't just pass the time, they stay with you. I'm Selena Brooks, 37, a single mom with 2 jobs and 1 truth. No matter how hard I tried, I was always the other daughter. My younger sister, Ariana, was the golden child. Our mother, Claudine, never hid which daughter she was proud of. And yet I still showed up, because sometimes we hope against experience. We found our table near the restrooms. I noticed the number as soon as we approached. Table 12 tucked close to a swinging door where servers shuffled in and out with trays of hors d'oeuvres. From that corner, you couldn't see the floral arch or the dance floor. The centerpiece was a little wilted, the linen slightly wrinkled. But I smiled anyway and pulled out a chair for Noah, who didn't seem to mind. He was far more captivated by the crystal chandeliers, which he whispered looked like spaceships made of ice. His eyes lit up the way only a child's can, completely untouched by social rankings or seating charts. He had no idea what that table placement meant, but I did. In my family, everything has a meaning. Even things we pretend are accidental. Table assignments, who gets a corsage, who is mentioned in the program. It's a silent language, and I'd spent my whole life learning it. Sitting by the restrooms was the polite way of saying, "You're invited, but please don't make yourself too visible." Still, I sat, smoothed my dress, smiled at the waiter. I wasn't here to reclaim a throne. I'd never had one. I was here because Noah deserved to see his mother as part of something, even if I didn't fully belong to it. I adjusted his tie, gently flicking off a speck of lint, and told him, "You look like the most handsome man here." He giggled, proud. That moment, just that, was enough to keep me rooted in my seat, despite the ache already settling in my chest. The music shifted then. A soft trill from the string quartet cued the bridal entrance, and a hush fell over the guests. Phones lifted discreetly, camera flashes readied. The large double doors at the far end of the hall opened with ceremony, and there she was, Ariana, my sister, 5 years younger, always the picture of grace. She walked in like a woman stepping into her destiny. Her dress clung to her figure in just the right way. Elegant, expensive, chosen with the kind of care that comes with knowing all eyes will be on you. Her skin glowed, her hair gleamed, and the room seemed to soften around her. She had that ability, always had, to pull a spotlight into her orbit. And as always, I felt myself shrink in comparison. There was applause, muted, tasteful. A few guests dabbed at their eyes. Ariana offered practiced nods and smiles, the kind you see on pageant stages or movie premieres. She passed each table like royalty on a slow-moving parade float, stopping only at the head table, where our mother, Claudine, waited with glass in hand and pride etched deep into every line of her face. Claudine reached up and kissed Ariana's cheek, holding her hands like one would hold a trophy. It was the most affectionate I'd seen her all day, and when Ariana's gaze finally landed on me, something in her posture shifted. Her smile dipped just slightly, like she had forgotten I'd be here at all. "You made it," she said, pausing near my table. I stood, smoothing my skirt again, offering what I hoped looked like a warm smile. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? Her eyes dropped to Noah. "He's getting big," she remarked. No hug, No kneel down to his level warmth, just a statement of fact. Then, with a flick of her gown, she turned toward the photographers waiting near the floral arch. Noah looked up at me, a little confused. "She didn't say hi to me," he whispered. "She's just busy, sweetheart," I said. "It's her big day." He nodded, content with the answer. But I felt the sting of it lodge under my ribs. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the practiced choreography of high society weddings. Waiters glided like dancers, trays of champagne flutes catching the light. Strings swelled in the background. A photographer scurried about, arranging people in clusters, snapping candid laughter and perfect angles. Ariana floated from table to table, glowing, collecting compliments like they were owed to her. The air buzzed with small talk, real estate, vacation homes, stock portfolios, and I answered politely when spoken to, even as I felt like a tourist in a country where I no longer spoke the language. From where I sat, I could see my mother laughing with old friends. Her laugh was always a performance, sharp, controlled, the kind that made people want to earn more of it. She never glanced my way. There was a moment, though, a brief second where I thought maybe this was going to be okay. Maybe I had imagined the coolness. Maybe Ariana's rushed hello wasn't meant to wound. Maybe the seating chart had been a mistake. Maybe my mother was simply overwhelmed. Maybe. Noah tapped my hand and pointed toward the musicians. "That's the song from the movie we watched," he said, eyes wide. "Remember, the one with the horse and the mountains?" I laughed quietly. "You've got a good ear." That moment, him, the music, the soft lighting, the hum of conversation, it lulled me into a sense of almost peace. I allowed myself to exhale, to let my shoulders drop just a little. Maybe I'd misjudged everything. Maybe the past didn't have to haunt every room I entered. That's the cruel thing about hope. It makes you vulnerable right before the fall. Because right around then, a man in a suit leaned toward his date and whispered something while pointing subtly in my direction. She looked over, then smiled a little too tightly. Not a smile of kindness, a smile of gossip. My stomach tightened. I turned away, back to Noah, who was now coloring quietly on the back of a menu with a red crayon he'd fished from my purse. I kissed the top of his head. "You okay, kiddo?" "Yeah," he said. "This is kind of fun." I nodded. I wanted it to be fun for him. I wanted him to remember this as something magical, not as something that told him where he stood in the family hierarchy. That's the thing no one tells you about being the black sheep. You get so good at hiding your hurt, you start to believe it isn't there. You convince yourself that being excluded is just part of growing up, that the table near the restroom is better than not being invited at all. But deep down, you still ache for someone, anyone, to notice you chose kindness over bitterness, that you came anyway, that you showed up not because you were obligated, but because you believed, somehow, that it still mattered. I kept watching Ariana. She looked effortless, radiant. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She never had been. That was her brilliance. Her jabs came gift-wrapped in compliments, dipped in charm. She didn't need to say, "I didn't belong." She just needed to keep making sure everyone else knew she did. When she passed me again, on her way to the photographer, she didn't even pause. Noah looked up. Why didn't she wave? She probably didn't see us. But he furrowed his brow, because even children can smell the truth. It wouldn't be long now before the speeches would begin, before the room would grow quiet, before words sharper than knives would be cloaked in silk and passed around like champagne. But in that soft moment, just before the unraveling, I let myself pretend. I let myself believe the music, the lighting, the buzz of joy might just be for all of us. That, maybe, I wasn't just the older sister with the borrowed dress and the wrinkled place card. Maybe for one brief hour I could be part of this family too. The clinking of forks against dessert plates quieted as Ariana rose from her chair. The microphone was handed to her like a crown. She stood tall in her fitted white gown, shimmering under the soft amber light of the chandelier, her perfect posture backlit by florals and expectation. Ariana always knew how to own a room. Noah looked up from his mousse, face glowing, unaware of how quickly things could shift. "Is she going to talk now?" he whispered, bouncing slightly in his seat. "Yes, baby," I replied, brushing chocolate from the corner of his mouth. "Let's listen." The room hushed as she tapped the microphone gently. "Hi, everyone," she began with practiced sweetness. "Thank you all so much for being here on the happiest day of my life. I'm truly surrounded by the people who matter most." I smiled politely from the back of the room, pretending, for Noah's sake, that we were part of that group. I even raised my champagne glass in silent salute. Ariana continued, weaving through romantic anecdotes about her new husband, Emerson, how they met, the fate that kept bringing them together, how their love had been effortless, undeniable, and meant to be. People chuckled at the right places. Someone dabbed a tear. For a moment, I exhaled. Maybe this wouldn't go the way I feared. Then she shifted. Her tone changed. Subtle, but there if you knew her. She paused just long enough for the room to lean in. "And of course," she said with a coy smile, "I want to say something special about my big sister, Selena." The spotlight turned, visibly, emotionally. I felt it burn. I straightened slightly in my seat. Noah perked up beside me, beaming with anticipation. "She's talking about you," he whispered proudly. Ariana's smile held, but her voice took on a silken edge. "Selena has always been such a strong example," she said. "She's the bravest woman I know. She raised a child on her own. No husband, no partner, just her. And whoever she could find to babysit." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Light at first. A few smirks, then deeper, louder. I froze. My glass stopped halfway to my lips. Did she wasn't done. "It's incredible," she went on, her tone falsely admiring, "how she's managed to show up today unwanted by anyone but still here. That kind of confidence, that's inspiring." The laughter grew louder, uninhibited now. Noah's head turned sharply toward me, confusion wrinkling his forehead. "What does she mean, Mom?" he asked in a small voice, his fork slipping from his hand. I couldn't speak. I felt the air leave my lungs as if someone had pulled a plug inside me. My body was still, but my mind screamed. I could barely hear the rest of what she said, if she said anything else at all. The only thing louder than the laughter was the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, from across the room, another voice rang out. Louder, sharper, meant to carry. "She's a used product," my mother Claudine called out between sips of wine. "But hey, she still polishes up well." It was said with such ease, such theatrical flair, that it landed with a thud of approval. More laughter followed, this time unrestrained, uninhibited. Glasses clinked, heads leaned together in delight, some guests shaking their heads as if to say, "Well, she said it, not me." I sat perfectly still. 1,000 instincts collided in me. Fight, flee, scream, disappear. But I did nothing, because Noah was watching. His brown eyes, wide with hurt, were staring up at me, trying to understand, trying to grasp how the woman who made pancakes in silly shapes, who patched his jeans and sat through every parent-teacher conference, was now a punchline at her own sister's wedding. I didn't look at Claudine. I didn't look at Ariana. I didn't even look at the guests who had laughed. My eyes were locked on my napkin, now clenched tightly in my lap, damp from the sweat of my palm. I couldn't leave. Not yet. If I stood, if I walked out now, they'd win. They'd laugh harder. They'd say, "See? She always plays the victim." So I stayed seated, silent still. But something inside me cracked. Not like glass, more like ice breaking under pressure. Quiet, slow, but unstoppable. I glanced around the room, searching foolishly for some flicker of empathy. My Uncle James looked away, suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. My cousin Madison typed something into her phone, likely already relaying the moment in a group chat. A woman I vaguely recognized from childhood stared at me with tight-lipped pity, as if she'd just seen someone trip in public and didn't know whether to help or laugh. Even Grandpa Leon, the man who once called me his little firecracker, couldn't meet my eyes. He stared straight ahead, lips pursed, frozen. The isolation was complete. Noah leaned into me again, softer this time. "Mom, did you do something wrong?" I shook my head, eyes stinging. "No," I whispered. "I didn't." But how do you explain to a child that grown-ups sometimes behave worse than kids? That sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who sharpen the knives? The rest of Ariana's speech was a blur. Whatever words she said afterward were drowned out by the roaring in my ears, the rush of shame blooming hot along my neck. I felt exposed, as if the spotlight had stripped me bare. But even worse than the public cruelty was knowing that Noah had seen it, heard it, that this moment would live somewhere in his memory. And the laughter, God, the laughter, it wouldn't stop. Not just from the ones who meant to hurt me, but from everyone who let it happen. Laughter is loud, but silence? Silence can be deafening when it comes from the people you once thought loved you. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to fold into my chair and sink beneath the floor, but I couldn't, because I was still a mother, and Noah was still watching. So I did what women like me have done for centuries. I sat up straighter. I fixed my face. I held Noah's hand under the table and squeezed, not because he needed reassurance, but because I did. The music picked back up. Dessert plates were cleared, glasses refilled. The party moved on. But something had shifted inside me. And though no one noticed it in that moment, they would feel it soon enough. Because humiliation has a way of planting roots. And even in rooms where you are mocked and dismissed, especially in those rooms, there will come a time when the very people who laughed will hear the silence that follows when dignity finally stands up. I don't remember deciding to stand. One moment I was seated there, frozen, humiliated, holding Noah's hand under the linen-covered table like a lifeline. The next, I was pushing my chair back, slowly, quietly, as if that might protect me from more eyes than had already turned my way. I wasn't planning a scene. God knows I'd avoided them my whole life. I wasn't going to say anything. I had no speech, no retort, no clever words stored up for a moment like this. I just wanted to leave, to get my son out of that room, to breathe air that didn't taste like shame. Noah looked up at me, puzzled. "Are we going?" I nodded, my mouth too dry to answer. I reached for my purse, my fingers trembling. There was nothing graceful about the movement, just the quiet, invisible panic of a woman trying to escape without being noticed, even though the damage had already been done. I started to turn, my hand on Noah's shoulder, the scrape of my chair still echoing in the quiet aftermath of laughter. Then, from the front of the room, another sound, a second chair dragging slowly across the polished floor. I stopped. Every head turned. Emerson Ford, still standing at the head table beside my sister, placed both hands on the linen and slowly rose to his full height. His expression was unreadable, serious, almost pale, but not embarrassed, not angry in the way people are when something inconvenient happens. Number. He looked deliberate, quietly furious in a way that commanded stillness. He didn't glance at Ariana. He didn't look at Claudine. His eyes locked directly onto mine. "Selena," he said, softly but clearly, "don't go." It was just 2 words, but the impact landed like a dropped glass. The room hushed again. The string quartet fell quiet mid-transition. The air grew heavy with unease, like everyone had collectively realized something had slipped out of the family's control. I didn't move. My hand hovered at Noah's back. The entire room stared now, not in mockery, but in confusion, in curiosity, as if something unexpected, something unplanned, was about to unfold. Emerson stepped away from the table, adjusting his jacket as he moved toward the microphone Ariana had just used to humiliate me. He didn't ask for it. He just took it, calmly, without drama. He stood in front of the room for a beat, letting the silence settle. Then, with one hand lightly gripping the stand, he began to speak. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was low, firm, not theatrical, not angry, just steady. I wasn't planning to say anything beyond a thank you tonight, but after what I just witnessed, I can't pretend it didn't happen. And I can't stay silent because silence is how things like this go on or far too long. Murmurs moved through the room. Someone shifted in their seat. I saw Ariana stiffen, the blood draining from her face as she reached for her champagne flute like it might anchor her. Emerson didn't flinch. Selena didn't come up here to speak for herself. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need a microphone. She didn't need applause. She just showed up. She sat quietly at a back table. She brought her son to be part of what was supposed to be a celebration. He turned slightly, eyes now moving over the guests. And what did we give her in return? Laughter. Ridicule. A public performance of cruelty dressed up as tradition. No one laughed now. "She's a single mother," he continued. "She's raised a kind, respectful son, on her own. That is not something to joke about. That is something to admire. That is strength. That is grace." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until he paused and I exhaled, shaky and silent. Emerson looked back at me, and this time his voice softened. "And while she stayed silent, I can't. Because if I'm going to marry into a family that thinks this kind of mockery is acceptable, if this is the tone we set for how we treat one another, then I need to ask myself, what kind of man do I want to be?" The room froze. You could hear ice melting in glasses, a single cough. The air conditioning humming faintly through the vents. I couldn't see Claudine's face, but I felt the shift in power from across the room. For once, her approval didn't control the current. The tide had turned, and the person steering it wasn't her. Someone dropped a fork. A gasp rippled from one of the center tables. Still, Emerson didn't stop. "I've spent the last year hearing about how important family is to this event," he said. "Tradition, appearances, image. And yet, in the span of 5 minutes, we managed to shame someone who should have been celebrated simply for showing up. That isn't tradition, that's cowardice." He turned finally to Ariana. Her face was unreadable now, tight, pale, her jaw clenched. "You didn't have to mention her," he said. "But you did, and you didn't have to insult her, but you did. And you made her son, her 9-year-old son, watch it happen." Noah's fingers were laced in mine now. He looked up at me, wide-eyed. "That kind of behavior," Emerson added, "is not what I want my future children to see, or to learn, or to emulate." Then he did something no one expected. He set the microphone down, not with force, not as a flourish, just final. Like a man who'd said what needed to be said and didn't care if anyone clapped. He didn't look at Ariana again. He didn't offer her a hand. He walked past the head table, past his own mother, who sat near the front, stunned, and out the door, into the night. No music played, no one moved. Even the servers paused mid-step, unsure whether to clear plates or hold their breath. I stood there, unmoving. My hand still curled protectively over Noah's shoulder. The words Emerson had just spoken were still echoing in the room, cutting through the flowers, the candles, the polite linen lies. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt seen, not for being dramatic, not for causing trouble, but for something as simple and as radical as existing with dignity in a room that tried to take it from me. The shift didn't happen with screaming. It happened with truth, spoken plainly, calmly, by someone who didn't have to say it, but chose to anyway. That's the moment the fairy tale cracked. And for once, I wasn't the one left in pieces. The moment Emerson stepped away from the microphone, you could feel the shift, not just in the room, but in the air itself. Something had cracked. Not loudly like glass, but deeply, like a pressure seam finally giving way. His words still hung in the silence, heavier than any toast or tribute spoken that night. There were no scattered claps, no nervous chuckles trying to break the tension, just stillness, complete, uneasy stillness. The same people who had laughed minutes earlier now stared at their napkins or their half-full wine glasses, suddenly unsure of the script. Those practiced social smiles so common at weddings had vanished. In their place was discomfort, uncertainty, and for some, I dared to think, shame. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not yet. Noah stayed close to me, his small hand still wrapped in mine as if holding on to something he couldn't quite name. And I held it back, not just to comfort him, but to ground myself in something real, because right then, the rest of the room felt unreal, like a stage being disassembled in slow motion. Ariana was still standing at the head table, lips parted but silent, her posture now visibly cracked. She clutched her champagne flute like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The glow around her, so meticulously cultivated through dress fittings, teeth-whitened smiles, and picture-perfect Instagram previews, had dimmed, and the guests, her friends, our relatives, the extended web of country club acquaintances and old family friends, they weren't looking at her with admiration anymore. They were looking at her like a stranger. Emerson, the man who just minutes earlier was meant to be her husband, had walked out not in anger, but in clarity. And that made it worse. He hadn't stormed. He hadn't shouted. He had simply told the truth in front of everyone, and then left. And there's nothing more damning in a family like mine than quiet truth spoken out loud. From across the room, I could see some of the older guests exchange glances. People who had known my parents since before Ariana and I were born. A few shook their heads subtly, as if realizing, perhaps too late, that something they'd been complicit in for years had just been dragged into the light. Claudine stood up. Of course she did. Her chair scraped against the polished floor with a high-pitched screech, breaking the silence like a cracked whip. She smoothed her dress with both hands and raised her voice, trying to reclaim the authority she'd always held with such ease. "What an ungrateful boy," she snapped, scanning the room for support. "To embarrass you like that, Ariana, on your wedding day. Typical, just like your sister. Selfish and dramatic." It was the kind of performance that used to work. In years past, those exact words would have drawn murmurs of agreement. People would have nodded politely, pretended not to notice the cruelty beneath the civility. Claudine had long perfected the art of the public scolding disguised as maternal concern. But this time, no one chimed in. Her words landed and then fell flat, like a balloon that had lost all its helium. A few guests looked away. One woman at the front table actually flinched. I noticed Uncle Howard glance at his wife and then gently place his hand over hers on the table, silently urging her to stay seated. Even Claudine seemed to sense it. She stood alone. The power she'd once wielded like a conductor's baton was gone, and she knew it. Her voice, while loud, no longer carried authority. It just echoed, brittle and exposed. Still, she tried again. "I raised my daughters to be strong," she continued, her voice now laced with forced dignity, "to stand on their own. But some people always find a way to play the victim when things don't go their way." She looked directly at me then, expecting, perhaps, that old reflex of mine, shrinking, looking down, swallowing hard and nodding just enough to let her believe she'd won. But I didn't. I didn't smile. I didn't wince. I didn't move. I simply met her gaze, calm and steady, and said nothing at all. And in that silence, something else shifted, something bigger. Because silence, when held with dignity, is louder than any accusation. Noah tugged at my sleeve. "Are we leaving?" he asked softly, looking up at me like he was ready to leave this room behind, to walk out with our heads held high. "Yes, baby," I said gently, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "We're going home." I stood slowly. My chair didn't make a sound. I placed my napkin on the table, looped my purse strap over my arm, and took my son's hand. We didn't rush. We didn't sneak out. We walked right through the center of the room, past people I'd known since childhood, past cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years, past neighbors who had watched me raise Noah alone and never once asked if I needed help. Some looked down. Some watched with open mouths, unsure if they should say something, if an apology now would mean anything. None of them spoke, and maybe that was for the best. As we passed the head table, I saw Ariana turn her face away, her knuckles white against her glass stem. Claudine, still standing, looked at me like she wanted to say more, but the words didn't come. Just before we reached the door, I heard someone behind me call my name. Selena. I turned. It was Grandpa Leon rising from his seat slowly, one hand braced on the edge of the table. His eyes, soft, familiar, rimmed red, met mine across the room. "I'm sorry," he said, voice gravelly and thick with something old. "I should have stopped it years ago." I couldn't speak. I simply nodded, because I knew what it cost him to say that. I knew what it meant to break rank in a family like ours. I didn't hate him for his silence. I never had, but I also wasn't carrying it for him anymore. Outside, the night air was crisp, cooler than I expected for a southern evening. Noah exhaled loudly, the way kids do when they've been holding in too much. He looked up at me. "Is the wedding over?" I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I think it ended exactly how it needed to." And we walked to the car, not triumphant, not broken, but free. Inside that hall, the music might have resumed eventually. The lights might have dimmed. Someone might have tried to carry on with the toasts or redirect attention back to the cake. But none of that mattered, because the fairy tale had ended. And for once, the person who walked out wasn't the villain, the outcast, or the burden. She was the one who kept her dignity and took it with her. We didn't rush. There was no dramatic exit, no slamming doors or shouted farewells, just the quiet sound of my heels against the polished floor and the soft shuffle of my son's dress shoes beside me. I held Noah's hand in mine, not tightly, not out of fear, but gently, like a promise. And in that moment, that single gesture said everything the microphone never could. We were leaving with our dignity intact. And for once, I wasn't leaving because I felt unwanted or ashamed. I wasn't retreating. I was simply done. Done apologizing for existing in rooms where I was never truly invited to stay. Done pretending that cruelty wrapped in linen and lace wasn't still cruelty. Done waiting for a family that had made it clear, time and again, that I didn't belong. The room didn't stop us. In fact, it parted. People who had just moments earlier laughed without hesitation now turned slightly in their chairs, avoiding my eyes. They didn't look hateful. They looked uncertain. Like they were watching something they didn't quite understand. And maybe they weren't supposed to. Maybe grace, when it finally arrives, isn't something everyone gets to witness from the inside. A few people opened their mouths, perhaps to say something, an apology, a defense, a last-minute salvage effort, but nothing came out. They stayed silent, and I let them. Noah squeezed my hand as we passed the last table. He glanced up at me, and his voice was soft, almost cautious. "Are we going home?" I looked down at him. His face was flushed, his bow tie slightly crooked, the chocolate stain from earlier still faint on his shirt collar. "Yes, baby," I said. "We're going home." We were nearly at the door when I heard my name, Selena. It was a voice I hadn't heard all evening, not since the ceremony, and not really for years in any meaningful way. I turned and saw him rising slowly from his seat near the wall. Grandpa Leon. He was older now, thinner than I remembered, his silver hair neatly combed back, his suit carefully pressed. There was a fragility in the way he moved, but his voice, though quiet, carried weight. He stepped toward me with care, one hand resting on the back of a chair for support. His eyes met mine, pale, wet, full of something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, that's all. "I should have stopped it years ago," he added, voice trembling just slightly. The room held its breath again, not in scandal this time, but in reverence. No one moved, no one interrupted. I looked at him, this man who once held me on his shoulders, who called me his little spark, who had slowly, quietly faded into the background when the family dynamics got too loud for decency to survive. I didn't hate him. I never had. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't as a child. Silence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's helplessness. Sometimes it's simply exhaustion. I gave him a small nod, not because I excused everything, but because forgiveness, when offered without ceremony, has a power all its own. "I know," I said quietly. He didn't stop me again. He just nodded back, his lips pressed tight like he was holding in something he'd waited a lifetime to say. And then Noah and I stepped through the doors. The night air hit us like a wave of clarity, cool, crisp, tinged with honeysuckle and salt from the nearby coast. It smelled like freedom. It felt like peace. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding my breath until I let it out in a long, steady exhale. Noah twirled under the moonlight, arms outstretched like a tiny airplane, then looked back at me with a grin that still had baby teeth in it. "Did we just leave a wedding?" he asked. I smiled, amused at his phrasing. "I think so," I said. "Or what was left of one." He seemed satisfied with that answer, content to climb into the back seat of my old sedan without another word. I buckled him in, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, and kissed his temple like I always do. It was such a normal gesture in such an unnormal moment. As I walked around to the driver's side, I paused and looked back at the building. The soft golden glow spilling through the windows, the music faint but still playing inside. It almost looked peaceful from the outside. If a stranger had passed by, they would have thought it was just another beautiful reception. Laughter, dancing, champagne. But I knew better. That building was filled with people who had just watched something crack and didn't yet know what to do with the pieces. And me? For the first time in a long time, I wasn't one of those pieces. I slid into the car, started the engine, and turned off the radio. We didn't need noise. The hum of the tires on the road and the quiet between us were enough. Noah stared out the window, the reflection of streetlights flickering in his eyes. About 10 minutes down the road, he spoke again. "Mom? Yeah? You didn't do anything wrong." The lump in my throat came fast and thick. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I know, sweetheart." He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Children don't always need the whole story to understand the truth. Sometimes they feel it long before they can name it. We pulled into our apartment complex just before 10. The porch light was still on. My little ritual, something I always left burning for us no matter what time we came home. I unlocked the door, and Noah kicked off his shoes, yawning dramatically. "Brush teeth," I reminded. He groaned like it was the greatest injustice of his life, then shuffled off toward the bathroom. I followed behind, watching his little shoulders, that stubborn cowlick at the crown of his head, the way he always hummed when brushing his molars. I stood in the doorway as he finished, handed him his favorite pajama top, and tucked him into bed like it was any other Tuesday night. But it wasn't. Tonight, something shifted. Not just in the family, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. I sat on the edge of his bed for a while, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing as he drifted off. The city was quiet outside, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I thought about the wedding, about Ariana's face as Emerson walked away, about Claudine's voice cracking into the silence. about how, for once, I hadn't flinched. I hadn't bowed my head. I hadn't let the shame stick to me. I had stood up. I had walked out, not in anger, not in defeat, but in peace. And that, I realized, was its own kind of victory. Not the kind that gets applause, but the kind that lasts. The next morning, I woke to the buzz of my phone. At first, I thought it was the alarm. But when I reached over and saw the screen lighting up with missed calls, unread texts, and an unusual number of email notifications, I sat up straight. Most of the names meant little to me. Some I barely recognized. Distant cousins, old high school classmates, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to since our boys were in Little League together. All of them reaching out. But for what? I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and scrolled further. And then I saw it. A text from a friend who had attended the wedding. Someone recorded Emerson's speech. It's on Facebook. Over 50,000 views already. You need to read the comments. My stomach turned, not in fear, but something closer to disbelief. I clicked the link. There it was, a shaky video taken from one of the side tables, framed just well enough to catch it all. Emerson, calm and composed, standing before a crowd that had just laughed at a woman and her child. And then, his voice, as steady as I remembered it, calling the moment what it was, cruelty disguised as celebration. I watched myself on the screen, still, expression unreadable, one hand on Noah's shoulder. Then Emerson turning to the crowd, the mic drop, the exit. The comments began to scroll faster than I could keep up. This man is a hero. She didn't deserve that treatment. This is the kind of ally single moms need. I'm crying watching this. Finally, someone said it. Dozens, then hundreds. People from all over the country chiming in. Strangers who had never heard my name, who didn't know a single thing about me, were standing up on my behalf, louder than anyone in that wedding hall ever had. One comment stopped me cold. She stayed silent so her son wouldn't feel shame. That's a different kind of strength. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, still in my pajamas, my coffee growing cold beside me, and felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Stillness. Not numbness, not sadness. Just a quiet, steady stillness. Like something heavy had finally slipped off my shoulders, something I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Later that day, I got a text from another friend, someone who hadn't attended the wedding but had clearly seen the video. Ariana's trying to spin the story. She's calling it a joke, says Emerson overreacted. I didn't respond. Because I knew the tactic. The family playbook hadn't changed in decades. When confronted, shift the tone. Rebrand the cruelty as humor. Blame the sensitivity of others. I had lived under that pattern for years, but this time it wasn't working. People weren't buying it. Not after the clip. Not after watching a room full of grown adults laugh while a child sat confused next to his mother. The kind of laughter that sticks to your skin. The kind people can recognize when they've felt it themselves. And clearly, many had. What started as one video on one Facebook page soon spread to other platforms. The clip made its way onto parenting forums, women's support pages, even a segment on a morning talk show that covered stories of unexpected courage. I watched the segment once, alone, while Noah was at school. The anchor, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, looked directly into the camera and said, "Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it looks like staying seated when the whole room turns against you. It wasn't my name they said on television, just the sister or the mother. And that was fine, because for once I wasn't the subject of ridicule. I was the quiet center of something honest." Later that week, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a bouquet of wildflowers, sunflowers, lavender, Queen Anne's lace, not store-bought, hand-picked, bundled loosely with brown twine, the kind of flowers you gather, not buy, the kind that grow freely. Tucked into the stems was a card, unmarked except for a single handwritten message, "To the lioness." That was it. No signature. No explanation. I stood in my kitchen for several minutes holding that card, letting the words settle into my chest. I didn't need to ask who sent it. I didn't need confirmation, because I knew. And it wasn't just about Emerson. That note wasn't from one person. It was from every woman who'd ever sat through a dinner where the jokes cut too deep, who stayed quiet so her children wouldn't carry her shame, who smiled through comments meant to shrink her. To the lioness. 3 words that didn't ask me to explain, didn't demand forgiveness, didn't question my silence or my choices, just honored the fact that I had survived a room that tried to make me disappear, and that I had walked out whole. I placed the flowers on the kitchen table. Noah noticed them when he got home from school. "These are pretty," he said, touching one of the sunflower petals. "They are," I replied. "Who gave them to you?" I looked at him. Really looked. At the boy who had sat beside me in that hall, at the face that now carried no trace of confusion or shame, just curiosity and kindness. "Someone who saw what really happened," I said. He nodded and went back to his homework. And that was enough. The days moved on as days tend to do. There was no public fallout from Ariana's side, no official statement, no apology, just silence. Her wedding photos vanished from social media. Her engagement post was quietly deleted. Friends who had once tagged her with heart emojis and champagne flutes now posted about other things. Life resumed, but the ripple of that night remained. Sometimes I still get messages, strangers who find the video, who share their own stories of being dismissed, of being humiliated, of never having anyone speak up for them, and I write back when I can. Just a line or two, not advice, not therapy, just something that says, "I see you." Because I remember what it felt like not to be seen, and now I also remember what it felt like when someone finally did. I used to think I had to wait for an apology to feel whole again, that one day someone would say the words, "I'm sorry for how we treated you," and the ache would finally leave. But I've come to realize I don't need that anymore. What I needed was my own permission to stop carrying shame that was never mine to begin with. I'm not the scapegoat of this family, not the quiet sister, not the cautionary tale. I am a woman who stayed kind in a house that taught me silence, and I'm done waiting for recognition to feel real. That wedding didn't break me, it clarified me. I walk differently now, not heavier, but firmer. Noah sees it too. He asks better questions. He speaks up when something feels wrong. He understands that being the little guy doesn't mean being powerless. And that courage doesn't always look like shouting. It often looks like staying, listening, and then standing when it matters most. The truth is, kindness isn't weakness, and dignity, once reclaimed, isn't something anyone can strip away again. If this story found a quiet corner in your memory, if you've ever swallowed your voice to keep the peace, I hope you know you're not alone. This is Renvenge Zinnia, where buried truths are finally spoken out loud. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need the same reminder. You are not what they called you. You are who you chose to become. Thank you for being here.